What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge and we are once again talking about the Tirpitz. Now I've already talked about the Tirpitz a couple of weeks back when these stats were first data mined from the patch files, and there isn't a whole lot that has changed since then. But I'm gonna go over it again anyway because now I do have some insight after actually having played the ship and having seen the stats in the game. Being a tier 8 battleship, we are of course comparing it to the other two tier 8 battleships, the Amagi and the North Carolina. In the category of survivability, the Tirpitz actually looks really damn good. It has 3,000 more hit points than the Amagi and 3,300 more hit points than the North Carolina. It's not a huge difference, but with battleships, HP does play a vital role, because the repair skill is based on percentage, so the more hit points you have, the more hit points you also restore with your repair ability. The Citadel on the Amagi is not great. It is relatively easy to hit, and the armor protecting it, while still very viable, it does still have problems holding up against tier 8 and above battleships. Their penetration values are just so high that they smack right through that Citadel protection. The Tirpitz's Citadel is very well protected. It is in fact so well protected that in all the games that I played, I have not received a single Citadel hit. Both the Citadel hit zone and the armor on the Tirpitz are wonderful. Everything I said when I reviewed the Warspite and was complaining about how I felt the armor was not good enough and didn't really hold up against battleships, and the superstructure being way too big and taking too much damage from high explosive, well, all of those problems really aren't that big a deal in the Tirpitz. A lot of the superstructure actually does have a little bit of armor and can stand up to some of the high explosive ammunition that's going to be fired at you. In the category of maneuverability, there isn't really all that much difference between these ships. Especially the Tirpitz and Amagi seem to be very similar. There is however one thing I would like to mention. As we found out after the last decloaking the patch, the rudder shift apocalypse wasn't actually a thing, and those new rudder shift times that are being shown on the 0.4.1 test server actually are already in the game. And this does have a slight impact on what I said a few weeks back, because with the old values, the Tirpitz is at 20.9 second rudder shift time, whereas the Amagi was at 20.4. Not really a big difference, and I said they were very similar in mobility. That is however not true, because as it turns out, the Amagi actually has a 12.1 second rudder shift time in the game right now. And the Tirpitz, I have tested this, has a roughly 16.5-ish second rudder shift time. This does make the Tirpitz quite a bit more sluggish than the Amagi. It does in fact make it even more sluggish than the North Carolina. And this is probably one of the biggest weaknesses of the Tirpitz. It is very susceptible to torpedo bomber attacks, because it is very difficult for you to actually get into the turn quickly enough to dodge any of them. There's not that much to say about the detection. The Tirpitz gets spotted at 16.4 kilometers, which is pretty much in the middle between the Amagi and the North Carolina. Its air detection range is very bad at 14.8 kilometers. So it does get spotted by aircraft a lot sooner than the other tier 8 battleships. Now when we look at guns, at first it looks very bleak for the Tirpitz. Not only does it have less guns than both the Amagi and the North Carolina, it also has far less caliber than the other ships. And so its HE damage with 4,400 and its AP damage with 11,300 are much lower than they are in the other two ships. Luckily the Tirpitz gets a rate of fire of 2.3 rounds per minute, because otherwise it would probably be one of the worst battleships in the game. That increased rate of fire does drag it out of the absolute swamp pit it would be in otherwise, and puts it in a position where it can at least somewhat compete with its AP ammunition. However, the HE ammunition on the Tirpitz is awful and should not be used unless you are firing at something that you absolutely cannot deal damage to with your AP ammunition. And don't be fooled by the relatively good fire chance, because the HE ammunition really is not good enough. And in most cases you should absolutely fire AP ammunition with this ship. Now the big thing about the Tirpitz is of course that it is the first battleship in the game to sport torpedo launchers. And now we know all the stats, last time I didn't know the damage. So the Tirpitz has two 4-tube launchers, one on each side, that have 90-second reload and a 6-kilometer range with 13,700 damage per torpedo. That is very much comparable to the current torpedoes on the Furutaka. As a Furutaka captain, I can tell you those torpedoes are pretty nice at tier 5, but their validity is questionable at tier 8. There are situations, and we will see that in the gameplay, where the torpedoes can absolutely save your neck. In the category of anti-aircraft, the Tirpitz is awful. Awful. even worse than the Amagi. Amagi has never been considered to be good in anti-aircraft, and the Tirpitz is even worse. Of course, neither one of these ships stand any chance compared to the North Carolina, which is an American ship and as such is loaded with machine guns and autocannons to take down all of those pesky planes. But I will say that the Tirpitz has great secondary gun batteries, absolutely capable of rivaling the Amagi in firepower, because while the Amagi has a larger amount of 140mm guns, the Tirpitz has 150mm guns. Alright, now let's get to the scoring. In the category of survivability, the Tirpitz absolutely takes the cake. This is the first time that I've actually sat in a battleship and thought, holy crap, I can take a lot of hits. All the other times that I jumped into a battleship, if it was the Warspite or the Ishitsuji, or the Kawachi, or the Miyogi, the Congo, or the South Carolina, the Wyoming, the Arkansas, with none of these ships I ever felt like I was really a big-ass, obnoxious, hard-to-remove tank. The Tirpitz has absolutely changed that. It is a tank, and deserves this point without a shadow of a doubt. In the category of speed, the Tirpitz does lose out to the Amagi. This is where the score deviates from what I would have given a few weeks ago for the other video, had I done scores there, because when I still thought that their rudder shift times were relatively equal, there was no reason to suspect that either one of them was better. But now that I know that the Amagi has a way better rudder shift time, it is just simply the more maneuverable battleship. 6 seconds to go into a full turn is definitely enough to at least mitigate some of the damage you are going to take from a torpedo bomber spread. Over 8 seconds, however, is not. In concealment, the North Carolina takes the point by being actually very stealthy. Now the reason this is worth a point is because the North Carolina also has a 23.3 kilometer gun range. Sometimes that allows you to actually fire your guns without really getting spotted all that much. And that is a very powerful ability. In the category of guns, both the Amagi and the North Carolina get a point because their guns have a fantastic amount of damage. And while I enjoyed playing with the guns on the Tirpitz, they are absolutely not as good as the guns on the Amagi and North Carolina. But in the next category, the Tirpitz of course gets its point because it is the only battleship with torpedoes. And not just that, the torpedoes are actually useful. It turns out with the battleships, sometimes you do get into situations where you're close enough to make use of 6-kilometer torpedoes. And I have dealt quite some damage with them already. And it does certainly add something to this very unique battleship. In anti-aircraft, who else could win but the North Carolina? 478 DPS at 2 kilometers is absolutely monstrous. I mean, hell, it has almost double the close range DPS that the Tirpitz has. And seeing how dangerous carriers get at higher tiers, this is a very important thing to have. But this of course does come at the cost of secondary guns, and in this category both the Tirpitz and Amagi get a point. The Amagi has the sheer volume of guns, but the Tirpitz has that slight bonus of having 150mm guns. And this brings us to a final score of 3-3-3. And as always, this score is entirely arbitrary and nonsensical, but during my play session with the Tirpitz, I was actually under the impression that it is a pretty damn solid ship for its tier. I never felt as outgunned or out-armored or outvalued as I'd felt with the Warspite. And now we'll talk about some more stuff as well as my opinion during the clip section. So as always in the quick evaluations, there's going to be a bunch of gameplay in the background showcasing the ship at hand, in this case of course the Tirpitz, while I talk about some of the peculiarities about the ship, my experiences with it, and what my final opinion and recommendation is. Now the absolute first thing that I want to get out of the way is that there were a lot of rumors that because this is a German battleship and because the actual Tirpitz and Bismarck had apparently very accurate guns, that this would be a theme for the German ships. This is not the case for the Tirpitz in World of Warships. In fact, the Tirpitz has the worst accuracy at tier 8. At 21.4 kilometers, it has a 276 meter maximum dispersion. The North Carolina has a 293 meter maximum dispersion at a range of 23.3 kilometers, and the Amagi has 227 meters at 19.9 kilometers. To most sensibly translate this, I calculated all the values for 20 kilometers. The Amagi has 228 meters maximum dispersion at 20 kilometers, the North Carolina has 251 meters maximum dispersion at 20 kilometers, and the Tirpitz has 258 meters maximum dispersion at 20 kilometers. That makes the Tirpitz's accuracy the worst at tier 8. I compared it with some of the other battleships in other tiers, and man, the Tirpitz is really inaccurate. And that's also how it felt while I was playing it. The next thing, however, that I want to talk about is that the Tirpitz has an amazing shell velocity. Absolutely insane. The first thing I had to get used to is that when I fired at people 18, 19 kilometers away, I could not fire over some of the islands on fault line. That's right, the shell trajectory is so incredibly close to the water that it is actually very difficult to fire over islands. But just to put this into perspective for you, up to a range of about 18 kilometers, the Tirpitz's shells fly at about 2 kilometers per second. That is ridiculously fast, and it makes aiming at ships so incredibly easy. As someone who's already used to the better shell velocity on the Japanese ships, this even better shell velocity on the Tirpitz is one of the things I liked about it the most. It just feels very fun firing at enemies when it is so incredibly easy to pinpoint the middle of their ship. But again, remember, you have very bad accuracy, so even if you can pinpoint the ship, sometimes just nothing happens. And that can be very frustrating, just like in any other battleship. The torpedoes on the Tirpitz are sweet. There's really not that much to say about it. They work just like any other torpedoes. And as a battleship, at least the way I play it, sometimes you do end up in situations where you're close enough to make use of them. And in those situations, it gives you the edge you need to win those close and personal brawl fights. It's of course not something you want to build your entire strategy around, but depending on how the battle goes, sometimes you have to go in close to contest a cap, and in those situations having torpedoes is amazingly cool. And now I would like to talk about upkeep. Now personally, I don't really buy premium ships or premium vehicles just to make a bunch of credits, but making a bunch of credits is definitely one of the reasons why I play premium ships. And the Tirpitz sadly is not exactly the best ship for making a bunch of credits. Now I'll gladly admit I didn't have any amazing games in it. I had a lot of very average games. I averaged about 1,100 experience, but that was pretty much it. I did about 1,100 experience in pretty much every game I played. And that usually yields somewhere between 200 and 300,000 credits, depending on whether you win or lose. Now if you get sunk, the full repair cost for the Tirpitz is 94,000 credits. And an ammo load for an average about 15-minute long game where you generally fire your guns often is about 15,000 credits more. So you spend almost 110,000 credits if you get destroyed, which only leaves you with between 90,000 and 190,000 credits. That's really not that much for a game that can last anywhere up to 20 minutes. So if you really just want a premium ship to make credits, you should not get the Tirpitz. You should get either the Atago or Atlanta if you want a high tier ship, or if you're just looking for the best premium ship to make credits, you should get the Murmansk. And let's face it, the Murmansk is also a whole lot cheaper than the Tirpitz. So what do I personally think about the Tirpitz? Surprisingly, I did not hate playing this ship. Now it could also have to do with the fact that I played most of the games with my lovely assistant Poi, Yudachi Poi, who also bought a Tirpitz and asked me if I wanted to do some division games, and I'm sure that contributed to me having a lot of fun. But even just the basic experience of playing the Tirpitz was not an unpleasant one. I think for me, actually being able to rely on my armor and relying on the fact that not every single HE shell that hits me is going to cause all sorts of havoc on my superstructure made me kind of more engaged in the experience. And the higher rate of fire definitely helps to keep my interest. Now 26-second reload are not all that much better than 30-second reload, but it's a start. And the torpedoes also added at least something that was different and new. So yes, I absolutely enjoyed my Tirpitz and I'm going to play it more. But as to the question of whether or not you should buy it, I cannot recommend this ship. I'm sorry. 60 euros is just too much money for a premium ship. And yes, I know it's not all the ship. In fact, I actually did the math and it's 10 euro for the premium account and another 15 euros for all the other crap that they throw in there. And so the Tirpitz actually only ends up costing 35 euros. But there is no way of buying the Tirpitz for 35 euros. Even for 40 euros I probably wouldn't say anything because that would just mirror the tier 8 heavy tanks in World of Tanks. But no, they sell it to you in a friggin' combi package for 60 euros. Because they know that people really like those German battleships. And are gonna buy the friggin' thing no matter what. Wargaming probably could have made the pack 100 euros and thrown in a bunch more crap that nobody wants. And people still would have bought it. But is it really worth it? No, it's really not. If you totally dig German battleships and the Tirpitz is like your dream thing come true, then I get why you would want to buy it. There's no reason for this thing to cost that much beyond simple greed. Alright guys, that's it for this quick evaluation. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you have any feedback, leave it in the comments. What is your opinion about the Tirpitz? Did you already buy it for the ridiculous €60 price tag? Or are you shying away because it's so crazy expensive? Do you think the bad accuracy and low DPS are enough of a detractor for you to not buy the ship? Or are you just more interested in farming credits and would rather get a ship that actually makes credits? Let me know! Next World of Warships review will definitely be the Wakatake review, but until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.